I came to this quiet village for a fresh start, but what I found was a mystery buried deeper than any grave. It all began at Hannah's funeral, when my dog Duke barked at her casket, refusing to stop. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't let it go. What I uncovered, secrets, betrayal, and a fight for justice, changed everything. This is our story, Duke's and mine, about courage, truth, and survival. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. It was one of those days when the sky mirrored the weight of the earth below, heavy with clouds and sorrow. I hadn't been in the village long enough to know Hannah, but everyone else had. Their grief clung to the air, thick and palpable, as I stood among them at the small cemetery. The locals barely noticed me, a stranger among their tightly knit mourning crowd, and I preferred it that way. Duke, my dog, sat quietly at my side, until he didn't. The priest, Father Michael, stood at the head of the casket, delivering his eulogy in a voice as smooth as polished stone. He spoke of Hannah's kindness and the void her death left in the village. Then came the barking, sharp, insistent, cutting through the priest's solemn tone like a knife.
Duke.
I hissed, tugging at his leash. But he wouldn't stop. His eyes locked on the casket, barking as though the wooden box itself were a threat. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, and I caught the priest's gaze. Father Michael's expression faltered. He glanced quickly at the casket, then back at the crowd, a flicker of unease betraying the calm he tried so hard to project. "Strange dog," someone muttered behind me. Another whispered, "Bad omen." I crouched beside Duke, trying to calm him, but his body was rigid with focus. He barked again, a sound that felt more like a warning than an outburst. My grip on his leash tightened, but my mind was already elsewhere. Why was he so fixated on the coffin? Father Michael cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the ceremony. "Let us continue," he said, his voice steadier than his expression. Yet his eyes darted to Duke one more time, and I saw it, something like fear. As the service continued, I watched the priest more closely than I intended to. The service ended, but the questions didn't. "Come on, boy," I murmured, tugging gently, but his resistance made me pause. There was something about his behavior that wouldn't let me walk away, not yet. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe Duke was being strange. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something beneath the surface that no one wanted to see. As the crowd dispersed, I stayed behind, letting Duke guide my eyes back to the casket. The villagers had gone, their murmurs of confusion and unease fading into the distance, but I lingered in the cemetery. There was something almost human in his focus, a kind of urgency I couldn't ignore. When we finally left, the air in the village felt heavier than it had earlier. I kept my head low, avoiding the stares of those who had witnessed Duke's outburst. Their expressions ranged from curious to accusing. As a newcomer, I wasn't exactly on the best footing with the locals, and this wouldn't help my case. Duke tugged me forward, his energy undiminished. It was as if he wanted to lead me somewhere, and I let him. My curiosity had already taken root, and it wasn't about to let go. We ended up in front of Hannah's house, a modest stone cottage at the edge of the village. The windows were shuttered, and the garden was overgrown, as if her absence had already stretched into months rather than days. The door was locked, but I noticed something peculiar. The ground near the doorframe was disturbed, the soil loose and uneven. Crouching, I brushed the soil aside and found a key buried just below the surface. It was old and heavy, the kind of key that didn't belong to a modern lock. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, something metallic, like iron. Duke padded in ahead of me, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. The house was small but cluttered, every surface crowded with books, papers, and knickknacks. If anything, it seemed as though someone had left in a hurry, leaving behind a life still in motion. It was Duke who found it, a stack of letters shoved into a drawer in the writing desk. He pawed at the handle until I opened it for him. The letters were tied together with a fraying piece of twine, and the handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably feminine. The tone was urgent, almost panicked. "What did you get yourself into, Hannah?" I muttered, setting the letter aside to dig through the rest of the desk. The second discovery was even stranger. Beneath a stack of loose papers, I found a small, folded map. It was crudely drawn, but the markings were clear. A red circle around a location in the village I recognized immediately, the church. Duke let out a low growl as I stared at the map, the pieces beginning to form in my mind. If Hannah had written about Father Michael and the map led to the church, then it wasn't just the funeral that connected the two. There was more, there had to be. The church stood silent under the weight of the evening's gloom, its tall spire piercing the dark sky like an accusation. It seemed almost too quiet, as though the building itself knew I shouldn't be there. Duke trotted ahead, his paws patting lightly on the cobblestones as I tightened my grip on the folded map. Now, the doors were shut, the windows dark, and the silence inside pressed against the walls like a secret waiting to be uncovered. I hesitated at the door, wondering if it would be locked. Inside, the air was cool and damp, tinged with the faint scent of candles long extinguished. I unfolded the map, the red circle burning in my mind. The altar loomed ahead, and I found myself hesitating, my pulse quickening. Whatever was waiting here, I had to face it. I tried the handle. Locked. That's where the key came in. It fit perfectly, and with a click, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into the dark. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows as I descended. Duke hesitated for a moment before following me, his nails clicking against the stone steps. The staircase ended in a cramped, dimly lit room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and ledgers that seemed untouched for years. But it wasn't the shelves that caught my attention. It was the small metal box sitting on the center table, pristine against the dust-covered surroundings. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. I unfolded it carefully, revealing a map similar to the one I'd found in Hannah's house. This one, however, included something new, a marking for a second location in the church, with the word basement scrawled next to it. A chill ran down my spine as the realization hit me. My pulse spiked as I killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Duke stiffened, his body tense as the footsteps grew louder, heading toward the staircase. Someone knew I was here. The footsteps above were slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, gripping Duke's collar to keep him still. His muscles were taut, his ears perked, ready to act if needed. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a faint beam of light spilled into the narrow stairwell. It didn't take a genius to guess who it was. Father Michael. "Who's there?" His voice, calm during the funeral, now carried a sharp edge. Through the crack in the door, I watched Father Michael enter. His jaw tightened, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker, anger. I didn't stick around to see what he would do next. "We've come this far, buddy," I whispered, descending quickly. The walls were rough stone, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Duke's nose twitched as he sniffed the ground, his movements cautious but determined. A muffled voice. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came again, clearer this time. A weak, strained voice, calling for help. "Hannah." I sprinted to the door, my hands fumbling over the latch. It was bolted shut, but the rusted metal gave way under the weight of my shoulder as I slammed into it. "David?" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay," I said, rushing to her side. "I'm here to get you out." He said I couldn't leave. Said no one would believe me. Her nod was all the answer I needed. Duke stood guard by the door, his growl growing louder. Footsteps echoed down the staircase, and I knew our time was up. "Can you walk?" I asked Hannah, pulling her to her feet. "I'll try," she said, leaning on me for support. Duke barked sharply, and I turned to see the beam of Father Michael's flashlight piercing through the darkness. His face was contorted with fury as he stepped into the room. You shouldn't have come here, he spat, his voice echoing off the walls. You have no idea what you're meddling with. You're right, I said, stepping forward, my voice steady. His hand moved quickly, pulling a heavy wooden plank from the ground. He lunged at Father Michael, sinking his teeth into the priest's arm. Go! I shouted to Hannah, guiding her toward the staircase. I'll hold him off. As we climbed, the sounds of the struggle below filled the air. Father Michael's curses, Duke's snarls. We burst into the main hall of the church, the cool night air hitting us as we pushed through the front doors. Duke emerged moments later, his fur bristling but unharmed. Behind him, Father Michael's footsteps faltered, and I knew this wasn't over yet. The cold night air wrapped around us as we stumbled out of the church. Hannah leaned heavily on me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Duke stayed at my side, his stance alert, his eyes fixed on the church doors behind us. We can't stop, I told her, glancing back. He's coming. Hannah nodded weakly, her face pale but determined. Her words settled something in me. What we had uncovered, what Father Michael had done, couldn't stay hidden. The villagers deserved the truth, and we had the evidence to give it to them. You have no idea what you're doing, he shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. His words stopped some of the villagers who had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. I turned to face them, raising my voice. This man has been stealing from you. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the weight of my accusation taking hold. Father Michael's face darkened, his grip tightening on the wooden plank. You lie, he bellowed. These are baseless accusations from an outsider who knows nothing about this community, I said, pulling the folded map and the evidence from my pocket. I held them high for the villagers to see. This is what I found in the church's basement, stolen donations and proof of his crimes. Hannah knew the truth, and he locked her away to keep it buried. A few of the villagers stepped closer, their eyes narrowing as they began to piece it together. One of them, an older woman, spoke up. Father Michael, is this true? He shouted. Everything I did was for the greater good. The crowd didn't look convinced. Before he could strike, Duke leapt forward, knocking the weapon from his hand. The crowd gasped as the priest stumbled, falling to his knees. Duke stood over him, barking sharply, as if daring him to try again. Enough, one of the men in the crowd said, stepping forward to grab the priest by the arm. If this is true, we'll let the authorities sort it out. As Father Michael was dragged away, the tension in the air seemed to snap. The villagers turned to Hannah and me, their expressions a mix of gratitude and disbelief. What now? One of them asked, looking to me. I glanced at Hannah, her eyes meeting mine with quiet resolve. Now, I said, you rebuild. You start fresh, with honesty. The crowd murmured their agreement, the first stirrings of hope beginning to take root. Duke lay at her feet, his tail wagging softly as if he, too, could feel the shift in the air. They'll come for him today, she said, her voice steady despite its weariness. The authorities. I nodded. It's enough to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. And the others he implicated, they won't get away with it either. Not after what I did. And you were right to try to expose him. What about you? What happens now? I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the village. Already, I could see small signs of change. Neighbors talking who hadn't spoken in years. A child playing with Duke, his laughter echoing off the stone walls. I think I'll stay, I said after a moment. For a while at least. Hannah smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through her exhaustion. They're lucky to have you. Not just me, I said, glancing at Duke. Couldn't have done any of this without him. At the sound of his name, Duke perked up, his tail thumping against the ground. You know, Hannah said, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. He's kind of a hero. Don't let it go to his head. People began clearing away the remnants of the old regime, accounting for the stolen funds, repairing broken relationships, and planning for the future. For the first time since I'd arrived, there was laughter in the streets, a lightness that hadn't been there before. That evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the edge of the cemetery where it had all begun. I rested a hand on his head, the weight of the past few days settling into something that felt almost like peace. "We did it, boy," I said softly. "We did what we came here to do." His tail wagged once and I smiled. The future wasn't certain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it might be bright.